By the winter of 1966, the lush province of Phuoc Tuy had become the epicenter of Australia's military commitment to South Vietnam. At the heart of this sector sat Nui Dat, a meticulously established base occupied by the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF. Unlike the sprawling, high-profile American installations, Nui Dat was designed around a different philosophy: dominance through presence. The Australians had cleared a 5-kilometer exclusion zone around the base, implementing a grueling schedule of deep reconnaissance patrols and ambushes that effectively severed the local Viet Cong VC supply lines. To the Regional Communist Command, the Australians were not just an obstacle, they were a persistent, irritating thorn. While the massive American search and destroy missions were loud and often predictable, the Australians moved with a quiet, professional lethality that made it impossible for VC units to move freely in their own traditional strongholds. By August 1966, the decision was made by the North Vietnamese and VC leadership. The Australian base at Nui Dat had to be neutralized, and the 1st Australian Task Force had to be dealt a decisive, humiliating blow. The plan was ambitious. The VC 275th Regiment, a well-equipped main force unit reinforced by local guerrilla battalions, began a massive concentration of manpower and heavy weaponry in the shadows of the Long Tan rubber plantation. Their strategy began on the night of August 17, 1966. At approximately 02:43, the silence of Nui Dat was shattered by the roar of incoming fire. Over 80 rounds of mortar, recoilless rifle, and artillery shells rained down on the Australian base, wounding 24 men. This was the bait. The VC commanders knew that the Australians followed a strict doctrine of counter-battery fire and immediate tracking of enemy mortar positions. They expected the Australians to send out a patrol to find the firing sites, and they had prepared a killing field to receive them. The following morning, on August 18th, Delta Company Decoy of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6RAR, was ordered to move out. Led by Major Harry Smith, a tough and disciplined former paratrooper, the 108 men of Delta Company were tasked with a routine patrol to locate the VC mortar positions. As they prepared their gear, there was no sense of impending doom, only the professional boredom of a routine sweep. They had no idea that they were walking directly into the center of a massive pincer movement involving over 2,500 veteran enemy troops. The stage was set for the most defining encounter in Australian military history. Delta Company was about to leave the safety of the wire and step into the Long Tan rubber plantation, where the emerald green leaves would soon be stained with the red of a desperate struggle for survival. At 11:00 a.m. on August 18th, the 108 men of Delta Company marched out of the Nui Dat perimeter. They were replacing Bravo Company, who had spent the previous night unsuccessfully tracking the mortar crews. As Major Harry Smith led his men toward the Long Tan rubber plantation, the atmosphere was thick with the oppressive humidity of the monsoonal season. The rubber trees, planted in perfect, hauntingly symmetrical rows, created a strange hall of mirrors effect, where visibility was clear along the lines but murky and deceptive diagonally. The transition from the dense scrub into the plantation felt like stepping into a cathedral of shadows. The ground was relatively clear of undergrowth, but the canopy above was a tight weave of emerald leaves. For the first few hours, the patrol was unremarkable. The men moved with practiced precision, 10, 11, and 12 platoons fanning out in a standard tactical formation. They found the discarded base plates of the enemy mortars and tracks indicating a hasty retreat, confirming that the VC had been there. But as they pushed deeper, the silence of the forest began to feel unnatural. At 3:40 p.m., the silence was shattered. 11 Platoon, led by the young and charismatic 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, spotted a small group of enemy soldiers dressed in khaki uniforms, a sign that these were not local guerrillas, but well-disciplined North Vietnamese regulars. Sharp's men engaged, and the enemy fled. Following the standard aggressive pursuit doctrine of the RAR, 11 Platoon gave chase, unknowingly being drawn deeper into a massive horseshoe-shaped ambush. Just as the first heavy exchange of fire erupted, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. Within minutes, the heavens opened. A torrential tropical monsoon began to lash the plantation, turning the red dust into a thick, slippery sludge. The rain was so intense that it hammered against the rubber leaves with the sound of 1,000 drums, muffling the shouts of officers and the cracks of rifles. Tension surged as the wind began to howl, and the mist from the rain reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. "Contact! Front!" came the scream through the static of the radio. 11 Platoon had run headlong into the main force of the VC 275th Regiment. From the gray mist and the driving rain, hundreds of enemy soldiers began to emerge, not in small skirmish lines but in massive waves. The Australians were no longer hunting mortar crews. They were staring down the barrel of a regimental-strength assault. Major Harry Smith, hearing the crescendo of machine gun fire, realized instantly that the routine patrol had vanished. In its place was a desperate fight for existence. The 108 men of Delta Company were now isolated, drenched, and surrounded in the heart of the Long Ton rubber, with the first echoes of a massive enemy force closing the trap. As the monsoon rain turned the rubber plantation into a blurred world of gray and green, the true scale of the disaster became terrifyingly clear. 11 Platoon, having pursued the initial VC scouts, was now pinned down on a slight rise, facing a frontal assault of staggering proportions. From the mist emerged waves of khaki-clad infantry, not the disorganized guerrillas the Australians had encountered before, but the battle-hardened regulars of the VC 275th Regiment and the D445 Battalion. The numbers were staggering. Historically, it is now confirmed that 108 Australians were facing a combined force of approximately 2,500 enemy combatants. The ratio was more than 20-1. Major Harry Smith, monitoring the frantic radio reports from his 3 platoons, realized that his company was being squeezed from 3 sides. The enemy was utilizing human wave tactics, surging forward in disciplined ranks, blowing bugles and whistles that pierced through the roar of the thunderstorm. 11 Platoon was the first to feel the full weight of the hammer. Within minutes, they were nearly cut off from the rest of the company. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp was killed while trying to direct fire, leaving the young Sergeant Bob Buick to take command of a shrinking perimeter of wounded and dying men. The Australians lay prone in the mud, the red soil mixing with their blood, as they fired their SLR rifles with rhythmic, desperate precision. Every time a wave of enemy soldiers was mowed down, another appeared from the gloom, seemingly indifferent to the casualties. "They're everywhere, Skip. They're crawling out of the ground," the radio crackled. Major Smith faced an agonizing decision. He could not retreat and leave 11 Platoon to be slaughtered, but moving the rest of the company to support them risked total annihilation in the open. The VC were now utilizing heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, splintering the rubber trees and sending lethal shards of wood flying like shrapnel. The battle had become a soldier's fight, a chaotic, close-quarters brawl where the Australians' superior marksmanship was being tested against the enemy's overwhelming mass. The 2,500 VC troops weren't just attacking, they were attempting to hug the Australian lines, staying so close that the Australians wouldn't dare call in airstrikes or Faubin artillery for fear of hitting their own men. At this moment, 108 men stood on the brink of being wiped off the map. They were out of sight of their base, drenched to the bone, and facing an enemy that had every intention of making Long Tan the site of Australia's greatest military defeat. The reputation of the Australian soldier hung in the balance, resting on the shoulders of ordinary men forced to do the extraordinary. While Delta Company fought for every inch of mud in the rubber plantation, the true savior of the 108 men lay several kilometers behind them at the Nui Dat base. In the desperate chaos of the monsoon, Major Harry Smith made the call that would define the battle. He requested danger-close artillery fire. This was a terrifying gamble. It meant raining high-explosive shells just meters away from his own pinned-down troops. The responsibility fell upon the 161 Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery and the Australian 103 and 105 field batteries. For the gunners at Nui Dat, the conditions were a nightmare. The rain was falling so hard that they had to use their slouch hats to cover the fuses of the shells to keep them dry. Working in the blinding downpour, the gun crews began a rhythmic, relentless cycle of loading and firing that would last for 3 grueling hours. At the heart of the killing zone, the forward observation FO officer, Captain Morris Stanley, was the calm voice in the ear of the gunners. Despite being surrounded by the deafening roar of small arms fire and the screams of the wounded, Stanley performed complex trigonometric calculations with ice-cold precision. He wasn't just calling in fire, He was walking a wall of steel around the Australian perimeter. The impact was devastating. 24 howitzers fired over 3,000 rounds during the encounter. As the VC ranks gathered for their massive human wave assaults, the 180mm shells exploded among them with surgical accuracy. The shells were timed to burst just above the ground or upon impact with the rubber trees, sending thousands of white-hot shards of shrapnel through the enemy formations. The artillery created a literal wall of steel that the 2,500 enemy troops could not penetrate. Whenever the VC attempted to hug the Australian lines to avoid the bombardment, Stanley would adjust the coordinates even closer, sometimes within 30 to 50 meters of the Australian positions. The ground shook with such violence that the Australian soldiers felt the shock waves in their teeth, and the air became thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized rubber wood. The guns! Thank God for the guns, a soldier from 11 Platoon later whispered. This coordination between the infantry on the ground and the batteries at the base was 100% vital to the outcome. It wasn't just luck. It was the result of years of rigorous Anzac training in combined arms warfare. Without that precise, relentless curtain of fire, the 108 men of Delta Company would have been overrun by sheer weight of numbers within the first hour. The artillery didn't just kill the enemy, it bought the Australians the most precious commodity in war, time. By 6 p.m., the situation for Delta Company had reached a breaking point. While the artillery provided a shield, the men on the ground were running out of the means to defend themselves. In the high-intensity firefight, soldiers were burning through their ammunition at an alarming rate. Many were down to their last magazines. Some were scavenging rounds from the webbing of their fallen mates. Without a resupply, the wall of steel would eventually be breached by the sheer persistence of the enemy. Major Harry Smith sent a desperate radio message to Nui Dot. Ammunition low. Request emergency resupply. Drop at my smoke. Under normal circumstances, a resupply mission in these conditions was considered impossible. The monsoon had intensified into a blinding white wall of water. The cloud base had dropped to less than 150 feet, and the lightning was so frequent it threatened to short out aircraft electronics. Furthermore, the Viet Cong had positioned heavy machine guns in the perimeter, creating a kill zone for any low-flying aircraft. Despite the risks, 2 Australian RAF pilots, Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Flight Lieutenant Bob Grandin, volunteered to fly their UH-1 Iroquois Huey helicopters into the heart of the storm. Flying on instruments through the turbulence, the 2 Hueys hugged the treetops, their rotors clipping the leaves. They couldn't see the ground until they were directly over the plantation. Below them, they saw the red smoke through the mist. The VC, realizing what was happening, turned their concentrated fire toward the sky. Tracers zipped past the cockpit, and the smell of aviation fuel mixed with the scent of cordite. With the helicopters hovering precariously just above the canopy, the crewmen, drenched and straining, heaved heavy wooden crates of 7.62mm ammunition and bandages out into the mud. They didn't have time to land. They had to kick the supplies out and bank away before the VC could zero in their recoilless rifles. The crates smashed into the mud right in the center of the Australian perimeter. Soldiers scrambled under fire to pry open the boxes with their bayonets and bare hands, passing magazines down the line. It was a shot of pure adrenaline. The sight of their own birds defying the storm and the enemy gave the 108 men a psychological second wind. The Hueys coming through that soup, it was like seeing the cavalry, one veteran recalled. We knew then that we weren't forgotten. This resupply mission was a feat of extraordinary airmanship and courage. It demonstrated the 100% commitment of the Australian forces to one another, the belief that no matter the odds or the weather, they would find a way to reach their own. The ammunition drop allowed Delta Company to maintain their rate of fire during the most critical hour of the battle, preventing the enemy from making their final, decisive rush before the sun disappeared. As the ammunition from the RRAAF helicopters reached the front lines, the battle devolved into a series of brutal, isolated struggles within the mud. In Australian military culture, there is no concept more sacred than mateship, the stubborn, unbreakable commitment to one's comrades. At Long Tan, this wasn't just a sentiment, it was the engine of survival. By the late afternoon, 11 Platoon had suffered the heaviest casualties and was pinned down in an exposed position. Because the VC snipers and machine gunners were targeting anything that moved, The wounded lay trapped in a no-man's land of red slush and splintered wood. Despite the terrifying volume of fire, the able-bodied men of Delta Company refused to let their mates die alone. One of the most harrowing accounts involved Private Barry Aka Meller. After being struck by enemy fire, he was stranded in the open. His comrades, seeing him struggle, did not hesitate. Under a hail of bullets that barked against the rubber trees, soldiers crawled out of their shallow scrapes, using their own bodies as shields to drag Meller back to the relative safety of the company perimeter. This scene was repeated dozens of times across the battlefield. Medics like Corporal Doc Staskiewicz worked in the open, their hands shaking not from fear, but from the cold and the sheer intensity of the trauma they were witnessing. Without morphine or adequate cover, they performed battlefield miracles in the dirt, plugging sucking chest wounds with plastic ration wrappers, while shells from their own artillery screamed just overhead. The Australians operated on a grim but heroic unspoken rule: no one is left behind. When 12 platoon attempted to reach the beleaguered 11 platoon, they moved through a crossfire that would have shattered less disciplined units. They didn't move as individuals seeking glory. They moved as a single, cohesive organism driven by the desperate need to save their brothers. In one instance, a soldier whose SLR had jammed stood up in the middle of a VC charge, wielding his rifle like a club to defend a wounded friend until a mate could provide covering fire. This wasn't the polished heroism of a recruitment poster. It was a raw, visceral display of loyalty forged in the worst conditions imaginable. This spirit of mateship was 100% critical because it prevented the unit collapse that the VC commanders expected. The enemy assumed that a 20-to-1 advantage would cause the Australians to break and run, making them easy targets. Instead, the Australians huddled closer, fought harder, and protected each other with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. By refusing to abandon their wounded, the 108 men of Delta Company maintained a solid, unbreakable front that no human wave could penetrate. As the light began to fail over the Long Tan rubber plantation, the situation for Delta Company reached its most desperate crescendo. The 108 men had been fighting for over 3 hours. They were physically spent, shivering from the cold monsoon, and the Viet Cong were massing for a final, decisive assault to overrun the Australian perimeter before nightfall. The enemy bugles sounded once more through the rain, a chilling signal for a full frontal charge. But just as the VC began their surge, a new sound began to rumble over the horizon, deeper than the thunder of the storm. It was the mechanical roar of the 3-troop, 1-armored personnel carrier, APC squadron. Led by 2nd Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, the relief force of 10 M113 APCs had been fighting their own battle just to reach the plantation. They had to swim their amphibious vehicles across a flooded, rain-swollen creek and navigate through dense jungle under fire. As they neared the plantation, they encountered a massive flank of VC troops, nearly a battalion, preparing to move in and finish off Delta Company. The APCs didn't hesitate. With their 50-caliber machine guns spitting fire, the armored beast tore through the rubber trees at full speed. They smashed directly into the enemy's flanking maneuver, the heavy tracks of the M113s grinding through the mud and undergrowth. The VC, who had no heavy anti-tank weapons on hand, were caught in the open. The Australian gunners on the APCs maintained a devastating rate of fire, scything through the enemy ranks. The arrival was like a scene from a nightmare for the attackers. One VC soldier was seen attempting to throw a grenade into an APC hatch before being cut down. Others were simply crushed or scattered by the sheer momentum of the 13-ton vehicles. The APCs broke through the final line of trees and into the Delta Company perimeter, just as the Australians were preparing for their last stand. The most beautiful sight I've ever seen, one Delta Company survivor recalled, was the silhouette of those steel boxes coming through the mist. The APCs formed a defensive ring around the exhausted infantry, their heavy machine guns providing a level of firepower the VC could not match. Realizing that the element of surprise was gone and that they were now facing an armored counterattack, the VC commanders finally blew the whistles for a retreat. Under the cover of the falling darkness and the persistent rain, the thousands of enemy troops melted back into the deep jungle. The silence that followed was heavy. The relief force had arrived at the ultimate 11th hour. Had the APCs been 10 minutes later, the story of Long Tan would have ended in a massacre. Instead, the breakthrough at dusk signaled the end of the onslaught and the beginning of a legend that would resonate through Australian military history forever. When the sun rose over the Long Tan rubber plantation on August 19, 1966, it revealed a scene of haunting devastation. The once ordered rows of trees were splintered and charred, the red earth churned into a graveyard of mud. As the Australians moved through the mist to clear the battlefield, the true scale of what they had achieved became 100% clear. They found 245 enemy bodies scattered across the plantation, with evidence suggesting hundreds more had been carried away during the night. For the Australians, the cost was heavy. 18 men killed, 17 from Delta Company and 1 from the APC squadron, and 24 wounded. It was the highest number of casualties the Australian Army would suffer in a single engagement during the Vietnam War. But the 108 men of Delta Company had done the impossible. They had stood their ground against a force 20 times their size and broken the back of a major communist offensive. The Battle of Long Tan immediately redefined Australia's military reputation on the international stage. In the eyes of the Americans, the Aussies were no longer just a small contingent from the Commonwealth. They were recognized as the premier jungle fighting force in the world. General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, visited the survivors to offer his personal congratulations, acknowledging that the Australians' discipline and precision had prevented a catastrophic strategic defeat in Phuoc Tuy. More importantly, the battle left an indelible mark on the enemy. After Long Tan, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars treated the Australian exclusion zone with a new sense of dread. They began to refer to the Australians as the ghosts of the jungle. The enemy realized that the Australians did not panic, they did not waste ammunition, and they never abandoned their mates. Long Tan had proven that an Australian platoon was as lethal as an enemy company, and an Australian company could hold off a regiment. Today, Long Tan is more than just a date on a calendar. It is the spiritual anchor of the modern Australian Army. It solidified the Long Tan standard, a requirement for absolute professional excellence, mastery of combined arms, and the sacred bond of mateship. The battle defined the Anzac spirit for a new generation, proving that the grit shown at Gallipoli and Tobruk lived on in the humid, rain-soaked forests of Vietnam. The 108 men of Delta Company entered the rubber plantation as ordinary soldiers, but they emerged as icons of military history. Their legacy ensures that whenever the Australian flag is carried into conflict, the world remembers the day 108 stood against 2,500 in the pouring rain, and the jungle ghosts were born.